with Coleman. My guest today is Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman is an American entrepreneur, venture capitalist, author, and podcaster, best known as the co-founder of LinkedIn. A former PayPal mafia member and one of Silicon Valley's most active early investors, he's a longtime partner at the venture firm Greylock, where he has backed companies like Airbnb and Joby Aviation. Reid is also a billionaire donor to the Democratic Party, which has landed him in hot water with Donald Trump, whose DOJ has signaled that they'd like to indict Hoffman, as they recently attempted to do with former FBI Director Jim Comey. In this episode, we talk about the rise of politically motivated prosecutions on both sides. We talk about why trust in institutions and in media has declined so steeply, not just in America, but throughout Europe. We talk about declining trust in vaccines and the medical system. We talk about whether billionaires should even exist. We talk about whether our democratic institutions are successfully holding their ground, and much more. So without further ado, Reid Hoffman.
When it's not always raining, there'll be days like this. When there's no one complaining,
You're good to me.
there'll be days like this. My mama
This
told
way is
me
way faster.
there'll be days like this.
Okay, Reid Hoffman, thanks so much for coming on my show.
My pleasure and honor. I've been looking forward to this for a month or two.
So we met at a conference years ago, and I don't know if we've ever crossed paths outside of that, but obviously you will be known to pretty much my entire audience as the co-founder of LinkedIn, as a major donor to Democrats, as a billionaire tech guy, and there's a lot to talk about. First, I want to just assume there's a slice of my audience that doesn't know who you are, however small, and give them a 1 or 2 minute version of who you are, how you came to be in the position you're in, and what you care about most right now.
So originally I was thinking about being an academic, philosopher, in fact, because I'm most interested in how we as human beings kind of understand each other and understand the world. It's kind of thought and language. So I did artificial intelligence at Stanford and philosophy at Oxford. And then I realized that I was kind of interested in this in a kind of call it scholarly, scholastic way, but in a how do we influence the path of the kind of evolution of humanity, societies, et cetera. Maybe I was reading too much science fiction as a child. And so, and had the benefit of going to Stanford. So realized about kind of software entrepreneurship as a way of shaping that and creating that. And so went back to the Valley, did a bunch of jobs, helped create a bunch of different companies, LinkedIn being obviously one of the more notable one. And part of the way that I kind of look at this is how do we have technology help us towards kind of how we evolve as human beings. And so, in a couple of my books, Super Agency, Impromptu, et cetera, I've kind of described us more as Homo techne than Homo sapiens, because the way that we evolve is through technology. The way we become our more human selves is through technology. Even though when we first invented technology, it tends to be something we kind of go, oh, that's kind of alien. But then we integrate it, whether it's, printing press or cars or planes or electricity or any of these things, and part of how we evolve. And that's the kind of the journey I've been on as an entrepreneur, as an investor, as a kind of a technology co-creator.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I think, I'm very much pro technological progress. I'm someone that follows Steven Pinker in believing that science and reason and Enlightenment values are the reason why you and I can expect to live to 80 or 90 years old. We can expect our children to live past the age to live full lives, which has been an expectation most human beings have not been able to have throughout history. We can be pretty sure there's not going to be a famine in the country that we live in, and that would hold even if we didn't live in America. I mean, there's so many things that we take for granted because they're right in front of our noses, and it is it's the human way to take things for granted. At the same time, I think some of the problems you've devoted yourself to, like political trust in institutions, is a big one from what I've seen of your public worrying out loud. Those problems seem to be, in my view, side effects of technology, right? Like you mentioned the printing press, obviously a fantastic step forward for humanity. In the near term, it created it created the Protestant Catholic split, which killed countless, hundreds of thousands or more in Europe, and certainly reduced. One way of looking at it is that it reduced trust in the Catholic Church, right?
Yep.
Which was a high trust institution before that. So one way of looking at what's going on right now is technology, whether that's even, something as simple as the TV, which we now take for granted, and then of course social media, is that reducing trust in our institutions in the same way that the printing press reduced trust in the Catholic Church? And if so, how do you square that with a general pro-technology bent that seems like is the core of your motivation?
Well, the simple highline answer is I completely agree that the transition times actually cause, kind of challenge and problems and suffering and so forth. In printing press, which I also covered in Super Agency, did create nearly a century, or facilitated the creation of nearly a century of religious war. And so what we should learn from that, I don't think, is not stop technology, but try to make these transitions less painful, less suffering, kind of more. I agree with you about the technology creates a reshuffle. The reshuffle, facilitates in human nature, kind of a degradation of trust. It's one of the reasons why I think part of our kind of moral requirement and our intellectual requirement is to focus on renovating institutions versus, tearing them down, as a kind of a general principle for these things. And I do think that, for example, like one of, two of the areas where I tend to think, for example, social networks are very legitimately criticized. One is children. And then the other one is, like things that facilitate, anti-vax conspiracies and misunderstandings as part of it. And those are instances of erosion of trust and, kind of creation of it. And so actually, in fact, what we need to do as a society is to say, hey, we need to get through these transitions to rebuilding to a newer, hopefully truth-seeking, kind of more accurate set of trusts on the other side. But I don't mean to underplay at all, whether it's artificial intelligence, social networks, the internet, mobile phones, the fact that the transitions create real challenges for people, for societies, and so forth. And part of what we need to be doing is figuring out how to navigate those challenges. And we can go in any of the challenges that you would like, or you think your audience is most attuned to. But I like long-term optimistic, short-term challenge navigation. That's the high line of it.
Yeah. So the anti-vax one that's an interesting case study because, in the 1970s, I think it was, I forget if it was bird flu or it was swine flu. I don't know if you remember this. There was an actual genuine vaccination crisis where there was a bad vaccine that was created. 60 Minutes covered it. Thousands of people took unnecessary vaccines. and many of them are believed to have gotten what's it called? Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
Something like that.
Yep.
It was a really nasty situation, and it's something that someone like RFK Jr. points to, and he says, look at what the medical industrial complex is capable of. Look at how vaccines can harm us. And he has a point in that instance, obviously. This is, now 50 years old. But I don't recall there being a sort of a generation of anti-vaxxers created as a result of that genuine scandal.
Yep.
Yet, during COVID, there was, to my knowledge, no scandal with the vaccines similar to that in scale, right? There were vaccines that were recalled because they caused blood clots, but the system, by and large, caught issues and responded to those issues, and the vaccines saved far more lives than they injured. And by the way, I have many criticisms of how COVID vaccines were rolled out, and
Of course.
and how the booster was, people were pressured to get the booster, even though later CDC data came out saying that people didn't need it, at least people of a certain age. But those relatively minor problems compared to, for instance, what happened in the 70s, caused such an enormous level of mistrust in vaccines that now you have people just like going back to basics and saying, does any vaccine work? Like, this is like to be skeptical of vaccines in general, including, like smallpox and like just these fundamental vaccines that nobody really disagreed about for, 70 years, has now become popular. And so this is an interesting case study in what is actually causing the mistrust. Is it that the mistrust is well calibrated to the scandals that the government is imposing on us? Or is it that we are now living in a media landscape where, unlike in 1970, 60 Minutes did a really good expose on what happened with that vaccine. What goes on now is that anyone with a YouTube channel and some charisma can spend every single day exposing both good faith and bad faith criticisms of the system, building audiences specifically built around skepticism on these particular topics, and feeding them one side of the issue and never the other side of the issue. And that just wasn't possible in the 1970s. If you were a consumer that wanted that, there would be nowhere you could go to get it. And so at the same time, what is my podcast other than something that's enabled by this very same ecosystem, right? People are a fan of me. I get the guests that I want to get. I give them my perspective on things, and they could legitimately worry that I'm not giving them the other side of an issue, right? I tend to be better than average at that, and I think I cultivate an audience that actually wants that from me. But nevertheless, I'm part of an ecosystem, and I love having access to these influencers and information, and something more than just 13 channels on TV. And yet I can see how it's contributing, maybe the main contributor to the lack of trust, which is not just an American phenomenon, but has also happened to varying extents in the UK, in Canada, in France, in Japan. I mean, so I mean, I don't know where the question is in there, but if anything I said provoked a thought, go ahead.
Well, absolutely. Look, I think you said it very well. I think you're substantially above average. One of the reasons I'm, honored and delighted to be on the podcast for it. And I do think that it's important to be considered and thoughtful. I mean, the thing that a general principle that I tend to think about is wherever technology is a problem, how do we shape it to being the solution? Because it does create a shift, as your earlier comment, printing press, others. And then the question is, how do we then make it into something that kind of creates a much better elevated human condition, truth in media, society, institutions, other things. And here, my tendency is to think that we should enable as much freedom of voice as possible. For example, even if you want to say the moon landing was faked and, other kinds of weird conspiracy theories that come up, or, the fact that, a vaccine can have a side effect for an individual means that it's doesn't understand the statistics of actually if 70% of us take it, then thousands of lives are saved, even with a weird side effect or two. And you kind of run through these things and you say, well, what's the way we could use technology to help solve this? And so like one of the micro things that I tend to think that would be a good thing within, call it the freedom of voice for all individuals, is to say, hey, if you're publishing through platforms that are trying to maintain trust, if, for example, you and I were to say, oh, I've seen medical evidence that it's proven that those COVID vaccines actually caused much more autism, or autism in equal quantities with the lives they saved, or autism at all, it would say, oh, actually, in fact, we have to add a note to this to say, medical experts disagree with this. This is why. Here's where you get the information. And if you're going to publish this, we have to add this note to what you're publishing, because it's trying to orient people towards a truth-oriented discussion. It's not saying you can't say, autism and vaccination. You can't say the moon landing never happened, but you have to say it with a reference to where there's a canon of truth discourse that disagrees with what you're saying. And that might be a good way to kind of blend the virtues of every voice is enabled together with platforms that enable truth seeking about, well, when we do have something that's kind of through, call it a scientific process of truth, which I think, generally speaking, the way that we do that in all kinds of society is groups of human beings in considered format studying something. It's everything from scientific method to, juries in court systems to try to be orienting us towards truth in that, and you use that as a way to reflect with technology back into a general discourse that, someone can claim whatever they want to claim for whatever particular reason they are claiming it, but still have that. That would be my orientation on this kind of topic, with then obviously a lot of discourse for how to make sure that works, doesn't get overly abused by political interests and other kinds of things. But that's been a reflex that I think would be a good evolution.
Yeah, I think that too. I think, and what that is an alternative to is the ever-present human instinct towards censorship. And I think we've seen over the past 10 years, all the people that have been censored, whether it's from YouTube or Twitter before Elon Musk took it over, or kicked off of payment services like PayPal and Venmo. I'm thinking of people like Nick Fuentes and Alex Jones. They've all come back with a roaring fury and the halo of martyrdom, at least to their fans. And most of the misinformation and lies, and in Fuentes' case, outright bigotry that he's pushing, have become more influential, it seems to me, as a result of the censorship in the long run. And I think we constantly relearn and forget the lesson that when you censor somebody, you do make them a martyr. And when they come back, people just listen to them regardless of what they have to say. And so what has worked, it seems to me, is the community notes and sort of grok checking tweets model, right? And this almost goes back. I mean, I remember every teacher I had in school would say, don't use Wikipedia as a source, which is, yeah, it's not a primary source, obviously, but it is actually fairly good on most things because it goes through a process of competitive editing by partisans on both sides. And what emerges is actually fairly decent. And so the community notes, I think, has worked on Twitter. It doesn't make the person who gets community noted into a martyr, which is key. It just, if they get something provably wrong. It just makes them look like an idiot. And what's more, the ability to use Grok to check every tweet, which reply guys are using on every controversial tweet now. You could just look into the replies and see what Grok has to say about it, is really important and adds context and checks people who are pushing BS in a way, again, that doesn't make them into a martyr, that just makes them look like a fool if indeed they're wrong. So I'm very happy with the way community notes and AI have influenced this. On the other hand, you have people who sincerely believe, and I'm not one of them, but I want to put the question to you. You have people who believe that AI has enabled or is going to enable misinformation at scale, right? If we thought misinformation was a problem now, wait till AI fully gets going on it. Maybe it's already happened. And they have certain valid points. The fact that you can now make, I think we can say this with confidence now, you can now make deepfakes that are indistinguishable from reality to the typical human eye. And I've fallen victim to some of them on Twitter, and I usually rely on the Grok replies to tell me if this thing I saw is real or fake. So what do you make of the threat from AI to the trust problem that we're talking about, and how do we preempt it or fix it?
So it's obvious that there is a deepfake problem, and again, kind of the general principle is let's stop technology, let's stop the ability to make deepfakes. Coleman, I don't know if you've seen that, one of the ways I've kind of played around is I made my own digital twin, Reid AI, and did various things with it just for entertainment purposes. And also to kind of show that deepfake is not, even in the case of a deepfake technology, there's good uses of it other than just kind of call it Hollywood, kind of character illusion and movie creation. I think
but you are the real you right now, right?
I am the real me. Yes. Although,
But
by the way,
that's exactly what you would say if you were a digital twin.
Yes. Although, if you asked me a question in Chinese and I replied in Chinese, then you would know it was Reid AI, because one of the superpowers that Reid AI has is being able to speak a number of different languages. So when I
Ni hao ma.
Yeah, exactly. I'm fine,
Okay,
thank you.
good.
That is actually how happens to be a piece of Chinese that I know. But like as an instance of it, I gave a speech in Perugia about the importance of humanism in the age of technology, and then had Reid AI give it in Italian and Hindu and Japanese and Chinese and everything else as a demonstration of the kind of pro-human characteristics for this. Now, that being said, the deep fakes is a real issue, and we need to then say, what's the way that we navigate that? And the answer is, as opposed to slowing down technology and trying to stop deepfakes from happening, because I think that'll be actually very difficult to do. You have open source models, you have a whole bunch of things. Open source models also coming from China and other places makes it very difficult to say, we will simply make it, the technology unavailable to create a deepfake of Coleman, of Reid, of, someone else. Actually, in fact, I think the deepfakes will be constructed, and what we need to do is say, okay, well, how do we, and Grok and community notes can be a useful tool in this, but actually, in fact, I think part of what we'll need to be able to do more of is to create some kind of, as it were, network of certification. It's almost like the crypto kind of like part of what I like about Bitcoin and the crypto stuff is there's actually certain kinds of distributed protocols that need to be added to the foundation of the internet, which include identity and certification in various ways. And so you can begin to say, hey, this is the certificate that Coleman and Reid used to sign the things that they said I actually did, like this podcast and so forth. And then that certificate could then be used as which of these videos, which of these audios, which of these, kind of things are actually, in fact, legitimate as a instance for how they roll. But I think we need to go technology forward to solve the deepfake problems. Now, there's hacks in between it, even if you don't say we don't have to reinvent the firmament of the internet for making this happen. The hacks are, one of the things you already see happening with deepfakes is the use of phishing. You get your grandma gets a call saying, "Oh, Coleman needs money desperately. Please send it," and it sounds like it's Coleman's voice and so forth. If you have a AI agent on your side that says, "Oh, wait a minute, this sounds like something that's potentially of risk. Why don't we cross-check this?" Like you're in this phone call. What's something that only you and your grandmother know? Ask that before you proceed in this conversation. And so I think there's various ways to also set up AI as the defense. Like it says, you see a video of Coleman saying, "I've come to believe that vaccinations are the work of the devil," et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, that doesn't sound very believable. And the AI agent says, "Yep, that's not very believable. That doesn't, like, we should really look at that to see if that was actually the case." And so anyway, so those I think are the gestures towards the solution, but it isn't trying to say that the problem doesn't exist. And it isn't, I think it's always a mistake in technology to say the way that you try to prevent the challenge of a technology is to simply raw forbid the technology versus shape it.
Let's move on to some other topics. I think every time I have a billionaire on the podcast, I have to ask them the billionaire question, which is, should billionaires exist? And there are many ways to object to the framing of the question, but this is how the question generally gets asked, especially on the progressive left. So I just put it to you. Should billionaires exist?
Well, given we're on a philosophical podcast, I will start in a kind of a first principles basis, which is I don't think anyone knows how human society works without inequality, right? That we have inequality and access to certain kinds of educational opportunity. We have inequality in terms of, you prove yourself as an athlete and you're LeBron James or you're, what else? So like the whole thing is a combination. Now we want as much opportunity spread across the hundreds of millions and billions of people as possible, but like the end results have unequal results. Person one is paid more than person two. The kind of the Harrison Bergeron or the dumbass, kind of sometimes communist thing to say, well, everyone should be paid exactly the same. It's like, no, that's not actually in fact that we have inequality. So then the question is how much inequality is too much? Because it's not the thesis that there is no level of inequality that's too much, but what are your principled bases for doing so? And then what kinds of inequality and how it gets there? And I think that the question, and like you can put this as like, well, should there be a hard number in a corporation between the least paid person and the CEO or the most paid person, and that ratio should be 100 times? And you're like, well, how do you get to that magic number? Is it because of your grumbling of your stomach and your intuition versus someone else's? It's like, well, actually, in fact, you should allow kind of market mechanisms and other kinds of things, be the determinant of that. There may be biases in markets that we need to fix. Markets are not perfect. They do need some, systemic kind of things. Again, not with magic numbers, but kind of ways they operate. And you could imagine that you say, well, individuals get so powerful, like the age of the robber barons, where, J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and everyone else were running the society, and it took a Teddy Roosevelt to try to correct it to being where the instruments of democracy were more important than that. And that could be something. Now, by the way, people say, yeah, that's what's happening now. And it's like, well, other than maybe in particular Elon's interventions, it's not clear that that's what's happening right now at all. And so I don't tend to think I think that the argument about whether or not millionaires, billionaires, multi-billionaires should exist, we shouldn't do it on a magic number basis. We should do it on a first principles functioning of the system basis. And in particular, I tend to be, maybe because this is, self-described, I tend to be more sympathetic to, kind of billionaires who made it through creating things that were very useful for society, than like inheriting it. And by the way, that's also, of course, sympathy for Elon and other folks, because it's like, SpaceX and Starlink and Tesla, massive contributions to society. And so, so I tend to think on a first principles basis, it seems that they should in the current configuration. But I'm willing to engage in the discourse on a first principles, not on a political rhetoric, the grumbling of stomach one versus stomach two, kind of basis. Because I think that's just, kind of the equivalent of ad hominem name calling.
Yeah, so I also think about this on a first principles basis primarily, but a different principle, namely, the real question is, do we care about inequality per se, or do we care about poverty and what the floor of a society is? So, for example, if I was like in the movie Soul, I'm a soul. I haven't gone into the human world, right? I'm choosing what society to live in. Society A is a society where the lowest people are earning $20,000 a year. That's like bare minimum entry level. You're working a janitor job, whatever it is. You can afford 3 meals a day, let's say, because the price of food is cheap. There's no famines. You can afford basic entertainment. You can afford education for your family. Like that's the floor of one society. But the ceiling is extremely high. There are Reid Hoffmans that have $1 billion and fathomless wealth that I'm unlikely ever to attain. But then there's another society that doesn't have any billionaires, but the floor is even lower. The floor is, say, 10,000, half of what I would be. So there's far less inequality in society B, but the poorest members of society are doing significantly better in society A. Like, to me, it seems obvious that society A is a better society, even though it has more inequality. Not only that, I would say 99% of migrants, given a full information choice between society A and B, would choose society A. So I'm making a deeper claim than that it's my value system. I actually think it's everybody's value system when they think about it deeply. And so, to me, looking at a society and asking how much income, say, or wealth inequality there is actually asking the wrong question vis-a-vis human flourishing and what we should actually care about. And then when you actually look at that question, and I had a socialist on my podcast recently, and I made the point, which is, even at the height of, you mentioned, the Gilded Age, when you had Rockefeller and all these people making all this money, well, at that very time, what was the number one destination for the poor migrants of the world? America. That very same gilded society that the rich were supposedly running into the ground, that was the society that Italians and Irish and Jews from Russia were pouring into by the millions with nothing through Ellis Island, because it offered them the very best opportunity in the world at the time to live a middle-class life, a better life. And so if you look around the world, it looks like, it quite often looks like the societies with the billionaires, like America, also are usually the societies with the kind of structures that help the working poor succeed as well. So that's how I view the whole issue. I think people look at it backwards.
By the way, I completely agree with the principles you just mentioned, because I do think that the question is, how do we create both the best rising of that floor plus the opportunity to make as much wealth, make as much progress, do great work as possible, which can go as high as possible. The one place I would kind of, as it were, steel person, the one place is if you say, well, actually, in fact, and this is one of the reasons why I think kind of questions around monopoly power and so forth are good ones for society to address, is if you get somebody who is so powerful that they're corrupting the system to lock themselves in a position of power, either individually or collectively, that gets to be a place where you should examine that some. And it's part of the reason why I think, like, for example, the antitrust stuff from the Gilded Age and, Teddy Roosevelt and so forth was actually, in fact, good for society.
I agree.
Right. So anyway, so where I think we're coloring in an area of very, very broad agreements within the philosophy of create human prosperity and human opportunity. And that's the most important thing. And you're going to have societies with a lot of inequality as part of that. But that's actually, in fact, the functioning of a society that creates a lot more, kind of humanist, like medical systems and elevating poverty and, to elevating people out of poverty and so forth, which is the most important thing.
Right. I mean, medical research is one of the prime examples of this. Like any given year, if you look at where all of the new medical breakthroughs are invented, it just so happens to be America. Why? Because, and this is the uncomfortable truth, I guess, is that in America, there's an opportunity for pharmaceutical companies to make oodles of money by inventing things that people will want to buy in order to cure or mitigate disease. That opportunity to make that much money is restricted in Europe for various reasons. And so only in America is it worthwhile for pharmaceutical companies to put up the billions of dollars required for the uncertain result of making that huge bag of cash at the end of the rainbow. And it might seem unseemly to someone without that bag of cash that people are making that absurd level of money. But not only do we benefit from the medical innovations, eventually the whole world benefits from those medical innovations as they condemn the system that allows people to get wealthy creating them. And so there is something very dark in human nature, in my opinion. And, I've been seeing it just more and more on both sides of the political spectrum lately. I've been noticing it more, which is the reality of envy. Like envy is the emotion, I think, perhaps more than any other, that has led to the destruction of otherwise good societies, right? If you look at every time the Jews have been expelled or pogromed in a country, or not just the Jews, the Pakistanis and Indians in East Africa, or the Chinese, the overseas Chinese in Malaysia and other places in Southeast Asia, they get expelled from these societies because they're doing too well, because they have too much money. They control, quote unquote, too many of the businesses, right? And then, like clockwork, when you expel them, the country does much worse off. It's just cutting off the nose to spite the face. And that's just one example of envy. But obviously, every country that has willingly elected communists, like true capital C communists, such as we rarely see anymore, was a case of basically of envy. And in those cases, the electorate gets what they want, and they get it good and hard, as the quote goes. But so there's a left-wing version of envy, there's a right-wing version of envy, and in my view, that's what motivates a lot of the anti-billionaire rhetoric, rather than a deep concern for the country per se.
By the way, the other thing, just as a general principle that I think is worth saying, because I agree with that as a instance of where people say it's better to tear the whole system down, is that the impulse to kind of tear the system down versus renovate the system is a extremely expensive, very difficult thing. It's the kind of thing that leads to like the French Terror. It leads to the Cultural Revolution. It leads to the Year Zero. And it isn't to say that, sometimes that may be the only path out, although frequently it's not. And it's and the cost and human suffering and the collapse of society is huge. But I agree with your envy point, and I think that it's also a, kind of think about how do we renovate our institutions versus how do we tear them down as a good general principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now, a lot of people feel that the threat to institutions is coming first and foremost from the Trump administration. And I'm of two minds about that, because in the first instance, I do believe Trump's personality tends towards authoritarianism. He is exactly the kind of president that the founding fathers were worried about and designed the system in order to contain. There's just no doubt about that, that if it were up to him, he would grab as much power as he possibly could. He would run roughshod over every rule that constrained his power. That seems obvious to me. On the other hand, it seems equally clear to me that the institutions are successfully holding him to account. And so I see some of the rhetoric which suggests that he is already sort of taken over democracy or already turned America into an authoritarian state to be alarmist. And I also think that there's a disturbing phenomena where the media actually stands to gain by convincing Americans that basically we've already lost our democracy, or we're at the 5-yard line with our democracy and we're about to lose it. And so there's a systematic, especially, I live in New York City, most people I encounter are liberal. There's a systematic underreporting of the instances that happen almost every day, recently in the news, of Trump's ambitions, being thwarted. Whether it is, the Supreme Courts look like they're about to rule against him on his signature tariff proposal, which I've been against since the beginning. The National Guard have been removed from 2 of the cities they were deployed to. And in general, the hyperventilation about the National Guard going into D.C. hasn't really borne very much by way of imposition on the citizens of that city. You've got federal court challenges to all kinds of things. His lawsuit against CNN, an appeals court ruled against it, and the attempted GOP redistricting of Texas, judge ruled against that. And so the judges are doing their job not only at the federal circuit level, but also at the Supreme Court level. And to me, it seems like a case where you have, like I said, a classic authoritarian wannabe that is successfully being held by the institutions. And that should make us feel, if not good, then at a minimum, we should not feel like we're losing our democracy. And I hear that tone quite a bit. So where do you feel we are right now? And where, if at all, do you disagree with the picture I just sketched?
So probably not surprising to you, I have broad brush agreements with the picture you just sketched. But perhaps a little bit more, critical of the Trump Foundation, the Trump administration than you just sketched. Look, I do think that a number of Democrats get a little histrionic, like, oh, we're not going to have elections next year. And it's like, that's like, I think, frankly, misleading. And then when people say, well, look, there were elections and you were just, everything that you said was just a bunch of histrionics and we shouldn't pay attention to, I think is a destructive thing. And what's more, when this kind of lefty progressive goes this histrionic, it covers the actual more relevant issues. And I do think that there is a certain amount of the tripartite, the judiciary kind of holding the ground, which I think is important. Although, the fact is, it's kind of like in a number of the instances, it's like stop breaking the law, like stop, invading blue cities with National Guard as a kind of way of doing it. The kinds of things you didn't cover that were also very alarming to me was the politicization of the military, kind of firing 31 generals as a function of it. I think it's important that the military, I think one of the subtle genius things that of the American system was that the military doesn't do its oath to the president; it does its oath to the Constitution, as kind of the way that it operates. And I think it's one of the things that we have, our forefathers and other folks have made a great system, and so the firing of those generals, I think, was a problem. The fact that yes, and I understand that this was speeches and so forth, but kind of the environment of risk where you got everything from Trump, kind of advocating for the execution of a chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff on Truth Social to, kind of doing the, Democrats should be executed for making a statement about don't follow illegal orders. It's kind of like, like this, apple pie and vanilla ice cream. Don't follow illegal orders. Like, great, yeah, don't follow illegal orders. As kind of a way of doing it. And so I think that the attempts to erode our system are, serious. I think words are actually, in fact, serious. I think they create a whole environment that kind of part of how society works is by belief in the fact that laws work and the fact that elections work, et cetera. And I think doing a variety of things to keep those reinforced, I think, important. And so I'd say that the critique of the Trump administration as being very corrosive to our democracy is accurate. I also agree with you about the Trump, tariff policies and so forth. And I hope that the judiciary keeps that, because that is a power of Congress, not a power of the executive. And the attempt to erode the powers of Congress, I think, is bad for the American system. But anyway, so I'm more critical than your picture of the Trump administration just outlined. But I do think the judiciary has elements of showing the kind of resolution, despite Trump's best efforts to countermand what the founding fathers were trying to limit the powers of the executive for, domestically, for very good reasons.
Yeah. Do you think that Trump is a singular threat as a result of his personality, and also his cult of personality? That is to say, the level of loyalty that he commands among his followers that is unlike anything we see from anyone else in the Republican Party, but also anyone at all in the Democrat Party. Do you think that because I agree with you when he, all of this normalization of the language, whether it was from lock her up to I'm gonna, everything you mentioned, the loose way he is with language, with threatening political opponents, with threatening violence, all that stuff, it all bothers me. But at the same time, I am sympathetic to the argument that if that stuff doesn't happen, we should judge people more by their actions than by their rhetoric. And so it does bother me. And do you think that he is a singular threat, or do you think that because of his success, the success he's had with the Trumpian style, let's call it, that we will be seeing politicians try to emulate that, freewheeling, say whatever the first thing that comes to your head, even if it's violent, even if it's nasty, push as hard as you can on the system, challenge every norm, don't respect, do whatever you can get away with. Do you think we'll be seeing politicians emulate that style for the rest of our lifetime?
Well, it's certainly possible. And, it should concern the various MAGAists that, by the way, we don't want the left to be emulating that style too. The far left. We don't, like I think what we want is much, heads towards centrism as we can, whether it's, kind of pro-business or whether it's pro-institution or anything else. And we don't want that. And I think that's one of the concerns, that it will create that. I think also that the kind of the questions around, even as the judge appropriately throws out the inappropriate indictment of Comey, the question is even like bringing that case as a form of, kind of autocratic persecution of an individual to create fear in other individuals to not counter the executive authority, because even, it's extremely costly for an everyday citizen to try to defend against that kind of stuff. And so that kind of fear of political abuse and persecution is the kind of thing we don't want either legally or normatively to things. And I think that the use of those kinds of things, not just words, are, kind of extremely, dangerous. And then, pardoning people who assaulted police officers in an effort at an insurrection where a bunch of the people were trying to see if they could kill Vice President Pence or Speaker Pelosi or so forth. I think those are all instances of, actual, in fact, corruptions of the system that are beyond just words. So I think we're actually already, it's not just the emulation of the word side, but the emulation of the activities and the furthering of the activities for political power. I think the genius of the American system, the wondrous of our kind of earliest democracy was the peaceful transition of power and the acknowledgement that the election is what works. I mean, for example, like one of the things I find completely nutty about how the administration works is you can only serve in the administration if you make some public statement to the fact that the 2020 election was stolen, which if you look at it at its outset is when Trump was president and there was a Republican Senate and there was Republican state of electors, Sleepy Joe Biden stole the election. But when Biden was president in 24, he didn't. That's the thing you need to publicly testify to be part of this. And that is a huge, I mean, it's bonkers. And it's a huge erosion of, trust in media ecosystems. And anyway, that's that kind of thing. I think where that goes is nowhere good.
Yeah, I think one of the best criticisms of Republicans that I've heard in the past year is when Trump won in 2024, there were actually Democratic Party insiders that asked a few questions. A, how did we mess this up? What did we do wrong? Was it simply not having a primary, or does it have something to do with the way we talk about political issues? Do we have a problem with wokeness? There was a wing of the party that didn't want to do any self-examination, but there was a wing of the party that was trying to do self-examination, error correction, and look inward and saying, what did we do wrong? When Republicans lost in 2020, there was like zero self-examination. There was like literally the very few people that tried to self-examine were effectively ejected from the party. And they all got around a total lie that somehow, as you said, the election was stolen when Trump was sitting, but then they weren't able to steal it when Biden was. Like, it makes no sense at all from a basic perspective. Trump constantly says, oh, I've got the evidence, but I'm just, I left it in my other pants. I'm not going to show it to you right now, but I've got a whole bunch of evidence. And there is an asymmetry there with respect to which party is actually willing to look into its faults, even if I think Democrats don't do as good a job as they could have, even on that score. But and when it comes to the political prosecutions, this is the point that I always raise to Trump supporters I have on the podcast, is how bothered I am by Trump's retributive instinct. I mean, this is a man who will literally file a lawsuit against a pollster who came out with a poll saying he was going to lose an election that he then won. Right? So he was not in any way damaged. If anything, the pollster's reputation was damaged by her failed prediction already. He was not at all damaged because he won the election, and yet, after winning, he's still upset enough to file a lawsuit against anyone who had the idea that he might lose. Right? Like that's a level of pathology psychologically that's actually difficult for me to understand. And at the same time, I think it's always important, especially if I have a Democrat on the podcast, to express that I thought the political prosecutions of Trump went overboard at the same time. And I think there was a lack of reflection on that within the Democratic Party. Like the January 6th prosecution seemed to me totally appropriate. But the prosecutions by Alvin Bragg and Letitia James seemed to me frivolous, and that they wouldn't have been done for anyone besides Trump. And then when it came to the classified documents case, this is a gray area for me because, there's a very good case to be made that the Espionage Act is just overly broad, and that's why it so rarely gets actually prosecuted. It seems like every president and vice president is taking documents home after their presidential term. And, Hillary Clinton, those emails disappeared after they were under FBI subpoena, which is not that different than Trump evading, moving boxes that were under subpoena at the same time. And yet she didn't get prosecuted for it. And that kind of made sense to me because there seemed to be a certain wisdom about amnesty for political officials not wanting to go down the Banana Republic route of putting people in prison, even if you technically can, even if they did in fact break the law. And I thought that Democrats and media outlets that were partial to Democrats didn't do a good job of being critical of those prosecutions at the time. That does not justify, to be clear, what Trump is now trying to do to all of his political opponents. But it is something that I think should be part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And actually, I think kind of political retribution, generally speaking, I mean, this is one of the things that I was kind of concerned with myself on the confidential documents case, which is this like the mob's like only thing we can get you for is tax stuff? We know there's a whole bunch of other stuff, but the only thing we can get you for is tax? Or is this just only the confidential document side? And at least the thing was being done very carefully. But like, I think the notion of kind of what is, it should, like when it's involving political figures, it should be something that is, kind of fundamental to the corruption of the state versus anything else. It's part of the reason why I thought there was, like oh, look, I'm going to take a plane from Qatar is like, we should be much more careful about this kind of thing. Anyway, so, but it's a corruption of the state more than anything else.
Right. And on that topic, it's been reported that Trump's DOJ is looking at you as a billionaire Democrat donor who has spent a lot of resources opposing Trump through the normal Democratic allowable means, and that you're on Trump's hit list. How afraid are you that Trump's DOJ is going to try to find something to indict you over? And what is it like to be in that psychological state of anticipation?
So I think it's kind of the instance of what's terrible and kind of anti-American on this. So I've been called out twice by Trump in front of the White House press corps. Once because I think he's angry at the fact that I called for the release of the Epstein files, and so it was like, we're going to investigate Democrats and Reid Hoffman for their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and I'm calling out the DOJ to do this. And you're like, well, okay, so I've already kind of publicly said that I regretted following MIT's lead in fundraising for Jeffrey Epstein, which is my interaction with him. And I wasn't partying with him back in his criminal days, unlike there's photographic evidence of a certain president doing that, President Trump. And then the other one, which is an executive order against Antifa, which, as far as I know, is a fictional organization. There is no such organization. And then saying, I'm going to investigate Alex Soros and Reid Hoffman on this. And so I think both of those cases, are kind of called out from the White House in an official capacity with directing investigations with, as far as I can tell, because from my perspective, zero evidence of anything, because I don't have any actual truth in any of those cases. And my guess is the DOJ is spinning up stuff because they tend to do, like a little bit like the Comey thing, like, okay, no legitimate prosecutor will file an indictment against Comey, so we'll fire them, demand their resignation, and put in a lawyer who has zero prosecutorial experience to ram one through that doesn't work. Everything that I've seen is the DOJ will jump anytime that Trump will do something on Truth Social. So I anticipate something is coming from a complete political persecution point of view. And what I think, obviously that's concerning and, has a personal story. But I actually think the more bad thing is the corruption of state, the corruption of American values and virtues. And I think that's the thing that we as a society most don't want.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that, and I hope that people see that these prosecutions for what they are, even if they are Trump supporters, and I hope that they realize this is the worst part about Trump. Right. The best part about Trump is that he can go to the Middle East and get these peace deals and genuinely get some foreign policy achievements that I doubt a Democrat would have been able to do. For me, the worst part of Trump is he sees a Democrat billionaire donor and says, how can we make this guy's life a living hell just because he opposes me in the way you're allowed to as an American citizen in a democracy? I mean, that's really disturbing to me. You mentioned that you said Antifa is not a real organization. When you say that, you mean they're not an organized group that goes under one umbrella, because obviously there are black-clad people in Portland, attacking journalists like Andy Ngo and surrounding federal or state courthouses during COVID or whatever it was. So when you say that, explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, the principal place that I've seen any references to Antifa is right wing or red media organizations. I've never seen any organization like that was described as an organization. I think there's individuals who might kind of describe themselves as Antifa, and obviously all political violence is bad. We should be discouraging it in word and deed, in any in any mechanism. And so, part of I'm just kind of expressing my shock when it was like, we have an executive order against Antifa and I'm going to investigate, Reid Hoffman. I was like, well, not only have I never funded anything that ever was anywhere even in the same planetary atmosphere as Antifa, I was like, I'm not even aware there's such a thing as an organization like this. The only place I've ever heard it described is in the Red ecosystem, and it's never crossed my path otherwise. So,
right. So yeah, I think the confusion there is that my assumption is that it is a network rather than an explicit organization, a network of individuals that meet up and discuss tactics and view themselves as anti-fascists, not as a proper noun, but as a normal noun. And they go out and do stuff like this. and they don't have a 501c3, obviously, or they don't have I'm not even sure if they have a national official body or a spokesman or anything like that. It's really a loose network. And so how do you combat a loose network? Essentially what you're talking about is they're criminals, right? They're criminals, and they, cities like Seattle and Portland have done a pretty bad job of just simply applying the criminal law to those people and those networks. But there's nothing to gain by, say, declaring them a terrorist organization, right? Or looking for Antifa in other countries and deeming them to be terror organizations as if that's like a real problem for Americans. What really actually has to happen is the police departments of Seattle and Portland need to prosecute those individuals that are committing these crimes, right? I mean, I think, we don't really need to seize emergency powers in order to do that. But at the same time, I think those cities have done a very poor job of actually clamping down on that issue.
I agree with everything you just said, and I think part of it is to not try to use the very legitimate case of when we do need to act on kind of terrorist groups to try to seize more executive power to kind of persecute your political enemies in an anti-American and undemocratic way.
Yeah. Okay, Reid Hoffman, we've reached the end of my questions for the time being. Maybe I'll invite you on another time. Obviously, best of luck, and knocking on wood that your legal troubles don't actually arise, and that if they do, they end up just being an embarrassment to the Trump administration rather than a serious headache for you. Is there anything that you can point my listeners to if they share your general concerns, want to support the work that you're doing? Can you direct them to any of your organizations that you're excited about right now?
Well, I think generally speaking, I think one of the things that's actually most important is something you were saying earlier, which is we should be raising the capabilities and the livelihoods of Americans across the country. So, whether it's the various things that I'm doing with Opportunity at Work, which is how do you get people of talent all across the country able to participate in the tech industry, or the Center for Rural Innovation to create economic opportunity rurally. Those would be the kinds of things, because I think that's what we should really be focused on most primarily as a society. So
thank you very much for coming on my show, Reid Hoffman.
Thank you. I look forward to the next conversation, whatever context it is.